Great, you're on, Chris.
Well, fantastic, everybody. It's an honor to be here with you all and have this amazing discussion with Brad on his new book with Ian Hathaway, The Startup Community Way. I can't tell you how grateful I am that Linda Rottenberg would support us in doing this with you all, because who can possibly embody in action and on the ground startup community building than Endeavor? It's no surprise that her leadership and many of yours appears quite regularly in the book. I've been proud to be an advisor, a mentor, ISP.
Oh, whoops, Chris, I think we might have lost you.
Ventures. In that time, and in the last 2 years in particular, the quantity of astounding quality entrepreneurs everywhere is one of the least understood stories of our time. I think you guys are changing your societies and communities bottom up, not with some Silicon Valley playbook, but with a global playbook that you guys, in fact, are writing. For all the success you're creating, it also astounds me, however, how communities around you could make your lives so much better and unleash you so much faster. And this brings us to Brad. Brad and Ian Bristol. These challenging days of COVID, one can lose track of the fact that quietly we've had a revolution in consumer and business behavior. You can pick your time frame anywhere you want, 10 years, 5 years, all rolled into now a couple of months. People just have a comfort with virtualness, which has driven hundreds of millions of people to order, buy, use mobile money, seek loans, take classes, see a doctor, and more, just almost overnight. This book, you and Endeavor have laid this foundation and now will be unleashed. Brad, as you know, has been one of the nation's leading investors, and unlike so many that we think come from Silicon Valley, he's based in Boulder, Colorado. He's known now for co-founding not only Foundry Group, but also the global platform Techstars. I think he's one of the most sought after speakers in startups and investing overall. If you're not reading his blog, Feld Thoughts, you have to. It is a must read on a host of issues relevant to our lives. I keep the most recent edition of his book, Venture Deals, which comes out with new editions periodically on my desk, and every VC and entrepreneur I know, regardless of their experience, refers to it regularly. On top of everything else, Brad is a fantastic friend and supporter of Endeavor. So with that as a start, Brad, it's great to be with you, and I really want to start with you if we could. And if you don't mind, tell folks, why are you in Boulder today, and how has that informed the way you're looking at the world?
I moved to Boulder from Boston in 1995. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, and my wife, Amy Batchelor, grew up in Alaska. We both met in Boston. We lived in Boston for 12 years, which Boston was very good to us. I like to describe it as 11 years and 364 days too many. I sold my first company in 1993, and I told Amy by the time I turned 30, we would be out of Boston, we'd move somewhere else. And 2 months before I turned 30, she told me she was moving to Boulder and I was welcome to come with her if I wanted to. And we've been married for a couple of years at that point, so it was a pretty strong hand on her part to say that she was moving to Boulder. We knew one person in Boulder, a guy named Vern Harnish, and he moved away about 6 months later. So we really moved to Boulder just for a place to live. And for me, I've developed a frame of reference around that over the course of the last 25 years, which is people should choose where they want to live and build their life around it versus go somewhere for an opportunity. I think that there's long been, the mantra, certainly today it doesn't exist anymore, but even in 2012, when I came out with the first Startup Communities book then, and really created the label Startup Communities, which didn't exist prior to 2012. People called these things, research clusters and innovation hubs, and every now and then you hear the phrase entrepreneurial ecosystem, but nobody knew what that meant. The mantra was still, oh, if you're serious about starting a company, you should do it. You should move to the Bay Area. And of course, Endeavor is a living example of the antithetical-ness of that statement, or the opposite of that statement. Techstars is as well. And sort of my whole life has been around that. It's like, no, actually, you should move to where you want to build a life and then build your life around that place. This has informed so many of the things that I've done, both as an investor, because we don't invest just in Boulder, Colorado, we invest across the entire United States. And our goal as investors are not to be investors in all the great companies in Colorado, but rather we have a strategy at Foundry to invest in companies within a set of themes. And so I really started to think about geography in a way, from my frame of reference, that was generative around the dynamics of how cities grow and develop and the importance of entrepreneurship in place and different places around the world. One of my assertions in that first book was that any city in the world that had at least 100,000 people could create a startup community, and I use Boulder as the example. Today, I believe it's imperative for every city in the world to have a startup community, and that startup community be part of the fabric of the generation, regeneration, renewal, and continued growth and development of the city, in the same way that many other things are important around the arts and education and other sources of commerce. But whatever happens within that infrastructure, innovation has to be a core of it. And the notion of startups, entrepreneurships, and startup communities are essential to that.
You launched something or described something in your earlier book and referred to in a lot of your thinking and speaking, which your new book is kind of a launch pad off of it. What is the Boulder Thesis?
So in 2012, when I wrote that book, we were just still coming out of the global financial crisis, right? The global financial crisis kind of ended 2010. The transition out of it was 10, 11. So that's when I started writing the book. And I looked at Boulder and I said, people were talking about entrepreneurship as the way out of the global financial crisis. And then they talk about cities. And there was an article that listed literally the Bay Area, which of course is not a city, it's a collection of cities, New York, Boston, and Boulder. And Boulder was something different. It didn't fit in that list because Boulder's 100,000 people. Like, we fit in a couple of buildings in downtown Manhattan. We just cram everybody in there. It's a little smelly and a little crowded, but we could do it in, the dystopian future where everybody has to live in high-rise buildings. So I came up with these 4 principles for the Boulder Thesis. And my assertion was that this is all you need to get your startup community moving. The first is that the leaders have to be entrepreneurs. You have to have a critical mass of entrepreneurs providing leadership and playing leadership roles. Not all entrepreneurs, but a critical mass, which could be a half a dozen, doesn't have to be a huge number. Second, you have to take a 20-year view, long-term view to everything you're doing. And I've adjusted that to be a 20-year view from today.
Yeah.
So now it's a continuous forward-looking 20-year view. You just have to have this long view about what you're doing with the startup community. The third is you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage at any level. Again, this is 2012. In 2020, the notion of diversity and inclusion, especially in tech and entrepreneurship, on multiple dimensions, notably things like gender and race, and especially in the US, but many other characteristics, age, educational background, just sort of broad inclusivity of anyone. And then the last is you have to have activities and events that essentially supersaturate things. I've been to, by the time I was 40, I'd been to enough Entrepreneur of the Year events. I'd gotten a Lifetime Achievement Award at 40, like, that's it, I'm done, 40. I then tried to get them to call it a Half-Life Achievement Award, thinking I would live till 80, and then my college physics kicked in and I realized half-life is probably not good because that would mean I'd hit my peak and everything from that point forward was a decay curve. Like, those things are fine, but they're completely insufficient. Networking events, go back to inclusivity, networking events tend to be exclusive. They tend to be hard to get engagement of people. So you really need things that engage people in entrepreneurship. And at the time in 2012, I gave examples of things like a Techstars accelerator or startup weekend. And of course, today, the notion of engaging people continually in entrepreneurship within a startup community or within geography is pretty well understood. These 4 principles at the time, many of them were counterintuitive, especially if you think about top-down control of things where, government saying, okay, well, let's try to make some entrepreneurship happen in our city. Or the university in the city is trying to be the center point of all of the entrepreneurial activity, and as the institution is trying to control what's going on and organize things, which is not how startups work and not how startup communities work. So with the test of time, 8 years later, like, I think these are fairly obvious today, but it's useful to time travel back and realize that at the time they were pretty counterintuitive.
And it's so interesting. So much of the thesis is at the essence of Endeavor and Endeavor Entrepreneurs. So it really is such a beautiful fit overall. So here you and Ian decide to write this book. What's new? If I'm an entrepreneur listening to you right now, how is this going to change my life? What am I going to take away that's different, that's evolved since you really came up with that thesis?
So in 2017, Ian and I started working on this book with the idea of answering the question, it's a sequel, And the question we were trying to answer is, what now? So, 5 years after Startup Communities had come out, a lot of people were saying, hey, we've been at this for 5 years. They kind of conveniently forgot the long-term view, the 20 years. And they're like, well, what should we do now? Like, we made some progress, but we're having some problems over here, and this isn't working. And oh, by the way, entrepreneurship is hot and trendy. So there's all these new actors in the system, and how do we think about it? So we started with that as the goal. We wrote a bunch. About a year in, we were very unhappy with what we'd written. And we did a bunch of soul searching and thoughts. And Ian came up with the notion that startup communities are complex adaptive systems. And we reoriented everything we were doing around the notion of complexity theory and using the idea of a complex system to help people understand how startup communities developed, grew, and evolved. We used that framing to create, and used a lot of words from complexity theory, like phase transformation, contagion, nonlinear, exponential, geometric growth, the notion that the parts are not the critical things that are important, it's the interaction between the parts. And we built on this language around complex systems. And for somebody who says that's nice intellectual theory, but I don't know what a complex system is, I'll define it with an example in 1 minute. A simple system is making a cup of coffee. There's a beginning, there's an end. You put beans in, you put them through some process, you get beans out. Now there can be minor tweaks to the process, but it's a process. It's a deterministic outcome with a deterministic beginning. A complicated system is doing your monthly financial statements. At the end, you have your monthly financial statements, a balance sheet, cash flow statement, a P&L. There's a bunch of steps. They don't have to be done in exactly the same sequence. You can do them slightly differently, but there's a playbook or a rule book or a way to do them. Maybe a more complicated version of a complicated system would be manufacturing Boeing 797s, a new Boeing airplane that hasn't been invented yet. Inventing it, doing all the work to figure it out, like that's a pretty hard process. Let's leave that process aside. But once you figure that process out, now you have an assembly line. You have a rule book. It's a big one, or maybe it's virtual. It takes up a bunch of space. Beginning, a bunch of inputs. Ending, output. Boeing 797 comes off the assembly line. A complex system is like raising a child, right? If you have mapped out the playbook for the child and you have the child's, and we've all either been parents or have been children, think about that dynamic. If the playbook is completely mapped out and exactly what's going to happen at each step is defined, and this is what you're going to be at 21, and this is what you're going to be at 30, and this is what you're going to be at 50. If your parents try to impose that on you, or you try to impose it on your kids, I can almost guarantee two things. One is something totally different will happen because of oppositional personality disorder that's innate in all of us as humans, especially with regard to our parents. And the other is we'll need a lot of therapy because you simply can't, from the top down, control the growth and development of the kids. The inputs modify what happens. That generates outputs, which create new inputs into the system. And the behavioral dynamics are completely unpredictable because of the collision of all these things. So that's the framing that we built this around, with the idea of giving people not just theory, but a lot of practical tools in the book about how to deal with this stuff. And I'll end, the question with one specific, which is a chapter we call the measurement trap. One of the big challenges of startup communities is the dynamic of if you don't measure it, you can't manage it, which is actually not really the line. The line is if you don't measure the right things, you can't manage them. The key is the phrase right things. Yeah. People generally don't measure the right things in systems. They measure the easy things. Dollars raised, jobs created, number of companies created, number of unicorns, number of exits. Those are the easy things. They are not the important things. The important things are hard to measure. The interaction are the important things. Interestingly, Endeavor's a leading thinker around this with some of the maps that you've created around different cities, exactly. Which is understanding those network maps and the interaction between the actors in the startup community. So we spend a lot of time in the book taking this complex system theory and applying it very specifically to the growth and evolution of startup communities.
What's so interesting is that you've pushed everyone in the community. I don't care if they're policymakers, I don't care if they're entrepreneurs or investors or anything else, to get beyond vanity statistics because we do it, we all fall subject to it, we all do it. What are the three things that make us sound good and are not getting to the kind of complexity and nuance that you suggested is so essential. But another thing that sort of is part and parcel with that, you just lay out, I think, fascinatingly in the book, which is this idea of capital. And you talk about unleashing capital, but you're not talking about money alone, are you? What does capital mean to you?
Yeah, this is also a reaction, and I attribute this to Ian in terms of the starting point for it. When people talk about capital in the context of a startup community, they're almost always talking about financial capital. And the discussion around capital becomes, there's not enough money here. And so you hear, it was in the first book, I talked about one of the classic cliche, number of cliches and things people say that are, and how to deal with them. One of them is, yeah, we want to build a startup community in city X, but there's not enough capital here. Again, really what they're saying is substitute the word money for capital or financial capital. So we came up with 7 capitals. And we said financial capital is one of them. You may not have enough financial capital right now, but you've got other capitals. You've got infrastructure capital, you've got intellectual capital, you've got social capital, and we define how those things play into the dynamics of the startup communities. So you, instead of focusing on we don't have enough capital here, concentrate on the capital you do have, you build on that particular type of capital, and they are all self-reinforcing. At different stages along the way, they generate different kinds of capital dynamics. And if we go back to the financial capital and money, for anyone who's in a startup community that has gone from a place where there was very little investment and there was very little focus on investing in startups, even though there may have been a huge amount of wealth in the city. But the people who had wealth in the city owned real estate, they owned industrial businesses, they might have had inherited wealth. They didn't generate that wealth from startups, and they didn't think about the startup community as an essential element. Over time, when that startup community had a meaningful exit or two, you would have a phenomenon called entrepreneurial recycling, where the entrepreneurs would start to recycle the money they made, and the early employees would recycle as angel investors, and they'd start reinvesting into new startups. A great example of this that people can relate to now because of the visibility of the company might be Ottawa, Canada, and Shopify. Came up on a conversation I had with Tim Ferriss on his podcast. I gave a talk in Ottawa around 2012, and people were really sort of like, how do we do something like this? Shopify, which has been a massive success globally, which is Ottawa-based. In addition to being a massive success, the founders and many of the early employees have invested in many, many other companies in Ottawa. Yeah. And there's this entrepreneurial recycling and vibrancy. And all of a sudden, there was a lot of wealth in Ottawa. All of a sudden, that wealth starts seeing this. And overnight, financial capital is not the discussion anymore. There's other issues. And there's other capitals that might be under-resourced relative to where they could be. But these things are all part of this complex system that evolves over time.
What is so interesting is that you have examples in this book from literally Indianapolis to Lagos. And of course, on this call, we literally have people from Latin America, United States, Africa, Southeast Asia, Europe. And sometimes people wonder, can there be one sense of community? What have you found through Techstars, or as you and Ian reported this book, and you have many examples from the Middle East and other places. What have you learned is applicable in the great variance and distinctiveness, which is a different geography and a different location? Or does this really work everywhere on its own terms?
Well, the last thing you said, Chris, I think is key, is it works everywhere on its own terms. So it's not the same. If you said, okay, I come to Boulder and I'm studying Boulder, and okay, now I'm going to take exactly what I learned from Boulder and apply it to, Toronto, Canada. That's not going to work. There are things that you would learn from Boulder that are very useful in Toronto, Canada, but you're going to invent your own stuff. It's actually one of the things that I personally really like about Endeavor and the Endeavor model. And it's something we've tried to do in Techstars as well, which is that each Techstars accelerator has its own flavor based on where it is geographically and what its particular focus is. We recently, within the last year, brought Endeavor to Colorado. We have an Endeavor Colorado chapter now. There are about 10 of us that underwrote it and funded doing it. The motivation for it, there's plenty of things in Colorado around startups, and there's plenty of things in Colorado around scale-ups. But one of the big motivations for doing Endeavor in Colorado was cross-interconnecting these communities and having the folks that are part of the Endeavor Colorado group be part of an international group to learn from other places in the context of scale-up, and vice versa. So that intermingling, that cross-connecting of networks is essential. And it then comes back to the beginning question, or the beginning part of the question is, you can learn so much from other people and other geographies, but you're not trying to emulate them or replicate them. Ian and I like to say, today, even Silicon Valley couldn't recreate Silicon Valley. It's this complex system that evolves in unpredictable ways based on all the different things that happen. And so you can learn fundamental principles from different places. You can get examples from different places, linking to those different places and having overlap both in terms of learning and active network activity and company creation is very powerful. By the way, I think it's even more powerful in the world of COVID, where two things happen. One is that we have obviously gotten extremely comfortable very quickly with working remotely and communicating and doing business remotely. The other is many companies, especially tech companies, are saying to their employees, live wherever you want. You know, you don't have to live in, the Bay Area anymore and commute to pick your office, right? Facebook's office or Google's office or whatever. They're saying move wherever you want and work remotely. And suddenly the ability to democratize all of these people around the world, live wherever they want. Well, when they come to your city because they want to live there because they wanted to live in that place, they have family there, they need something different, they met a person and decided to go somewhere different, they need a completely different type of lifestyle. Well, while they may be virtually connected to their company, they're going to want to be part of whatever that local geographic community is. And that creates another layer that allows you to have this overlap and this connect back to each other.
You know, it's interesting. I was just thinking about this not long ago. Last fall, I happened to be in China, and by coincidence, Endeavor was doing one of their amazing trips where they had about 15 or 17 fintech entrepreneurs from Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America that were visiting the juggernauts of fintech in China. And Linda has long talked about what she calls E to E, emerging market to emerging market, this kind of connective tissue that for all the distinction geographically, ethnicity, language, and so on, there's actually something profoundly shared. And it blew me away in watching these entrepreneurs talk to these Chinese juggernauts, because I realized 70% of that conversation would not be happening in New York or Silicon Valley. It's about last mile logistics, navigating regulatory environments that change all the time, educating customers who never had a credit card but now have financial inclusion, and on and on. And of course, the Chinese spoke perfectly to them because they spoke the language of rising markets. So the more I listened to you and read your book and think about it, I mean, really the question of what's the next Silicon Valley is just utterly irrelevant today. Is that true?
Yes. Irrelevant. Doesn't matter. And by the way, right, Silicon Valley still has some amazing characteristics and will continue to generate, incredible entrepreneurial activity, for the foreseeable future. But it also has some very fundamental structural weaknesses that other geographies have massive advantages over, both in terms of, you gave the example of context, right? When you're insular and you're in a particular geography and you're building for each other, some layer of insularity starts to develop. And we see that today globally in solutions that have been very effective that have come out of companies in Silicon Valley, but then other things that are emerging in lots of other parts of the world that then companies that are Bay Area based are trying to follow or trying to emulate rather than being the source of innovation. Another dynamic, which is sort of very front and center, is just fundamental cost structure. The fundamental cost structure in a place like the Bay Area is dramatically disadvantaged to the cost structure in other places. And by the way, it's one of the interesting debates around remote work, right? If I live in the Bay Area right now and I work for, pick your company, and I get paid a certain amount and I move somewhere else, and my cost of living in that somewhere else is, I can buy a house that's 5 times bigger for what I'm paying for my 2-bedroom apartment, and all my other cost structures go down significantly. There's 2 ways to think about it, right? Well, you should get paid the same salary you're getting paid before because of the work you're doing, or is, that company's going to look at it and say, well, but your cost structure is lower. The reason we're paying more is because of inflated cost structure, so we should pay you less. So there's just even the fact that debate exists. Forget about what the right answer is. The fact that it exists means that there are some structural disadvantages in the context of company creation. And then the last, and I'm just going to come back to what you said. I have an extraordinarily deep belief that entrepreneurship is not the only thing, but a key thing to the health and growth and development of society and of cities and of people and the human experience. And you can debate lots of different elements of that. And there's lots of things that are challenges around entrepreneurship being that, which is why I say it's not the only thing. I believe that what we've seen in the last 8 years is an incredible democratization of entrepreneurship globally. Some of that is the democratization of information, right? The availability of information. I think some of it is radical change in consumer and business behavior, user behavior as a result of enabling of technology. And I think the COVID crisis is accelerating a number of different things on that front. I like to say that I'm now trying to live in 2025. I'm not a predictor of what happens in the future, but I literally just say, all right, how do I want to live in 2025? In 2025, I'll be 60 years old. I know that the technologies exist for me to live however I want. What do I want to do? How do I want to do it? How do I want to behave? And I think COVID is causing many people to rethink that if they have the resources or ability to. For much of society, it's creating enormous pressure, both economic as well as health and mental health. And, in the US, also in terms of equity, especially on racial equity dimension. And in that, I think there's a lot of rethinking of how to live that isn't going to be, okay, well, this is over. Let's go back to how we were in February of 2020. It's going to be, no, a phase transition, and now we're living a different way. I don't know what that different way is. I'm not going to predict it, but I think it's a powerful thing for all entrepreneurs to try to envision themselves being in that mode, especially if you have topophilia and care about where you live, love of place, and are trying to build your startup community and your city in that place along with your company. And when you start to think about what for you and for the people you live with and the people you care about is a better and healthier, and I use that word on multiple dimensions, a future way to live in a future society.
We're going to get to some amazing questions that the folks here have sent to me, but two quick ones if I could to wrap on our side of it. First of all, you talk a lot about physical place. I mean, there was two kind of vectors of these. There was always a conventional wisdom, could be Hollywood and film or finance in New York, that physical place mattered, but you get a network effect of talent when people want to be there physically, even if virtual in this open stuff. And then there's another element of it, which is very interesting. I talked to a bunch of Chinese CEOs, early stage, growth stage companies, and asked them, as they're the first country to quote unquote come back from COVID, what surprised them most from being virtual to now being physical? And to a woman and man, they said the same thing. They said, our culture suffered. And I said, what do you mean? They said, look, there's awesome, everything's virtual is awesome at work, but there are little conversations we didn't have. There's just a physical connectivity and look in the eye that we didn't have. And we had to spend the first couple of weeks of coming back, kind of making sure our culture is aligned. How do you think about the physicality going forward?
I think it varies dramatically. And so I think the absolute statement of, yeah, we survived the virtual experience, but now we're going back to a fully physical world and we need to do that is changing on many dimensions. And part of the challenge with that is that there's enormous inefficiencies in the way we spend physical time together. And those inefficiencies are ones that we culturally did because they were part of the function of the way that our business culture and our work culture worked, separate from things that were additive and meaningful in terms of being in person with people. One of the examples I like to use is anybody who's in their 50s or 60s has probably been to a very large number of weeknight dinners that were business-related dinners with colleagues. There are some people, I don't know, 50% of the population who love that kind of social engagement and love that kind of social interaction. And there are probably 50% of the population, I don't know, I'm making up numbers, who don't. I'm in the don't. I would much rather, when I'm at the end of my quote workday, spend time with my wife, Amy, lay on the couch and read a book, and not spend another 2 or 3 hours at dinner. I don't drink, so the whole sort of socialization around that is a miss for me, or missed for me. I just give that as one example, right? Think about all of the meetings that you have flown to and then had half the people in the meeting on conference calls somewhere else because they were somewhere else. And all of the amount of time you spent getting from point A to point B and being in point B that actually was unnecessary. It's not to say that 0 is the answer, but there's an enormous amount of that fabric that's unnecessary and that's wasted energy. And I think that we will readjust that quite significantly. In addition, we have a number of things in business that I think are under great question. One of my favorite is commercial office space. Richard Florida, who I have enormous respect for, and his book, Rise of the Creative Class, is one of the books that has inspired so much of what I've done, really was the creator of new urbanism and the idea of re-urbanism and people moving back to cities from suburbs, right? The Taylorism view of the world and the disbursement to suburbs from cities. Today, with sort of living through COVID, the idea of people going back to office spaces in the density that they were before makes no sense. The number of companies in our portfolio where when you actually survey the employees and say, how many of you would rather be in an office or work from home, not just today, but in the future, there's a very substantial percentage that want to continue to work from home. There's plenty that need to work in an office because it's difficult at home. And then if you give people the answer of, if we gave you money, how much money would you need to be able to configure your work from home environment to be one that you're really happy about? It's fascinating responses to this, which is not, we all want to go back to the 42nd floor of our building in our office and sit at our desks all day. So we are in a place where it's going to change. In addition, the fidelity of the interaction, right? We're only 3 or 4 months into really operating as a society remote via video. Chris and I spend plenty of time together. I can read his facial cues, even with the choppiness of the internet. I can see when he's giving me the facial cue of, hey, Brad, wrap up your answer, time for the next question. I know Chris, right? So I can see that. If you haven't interacted with a person, you're not picking up those cues, and especially in cultures where there's a lot of that in the negotiation of the business dynamic. However, that doesn't mean that you have to do that to get good at that. And I actually encourage all of the CEOs in our portfolio to really work hard at getting good at those kinds of one-to-one interactions and learning how to do them in an intentional, not distracted way with whoever they're dealing with so that they get good at understanding it. And by the way, you can look into somebody's eyes on video conferencing just as well as you can look into somebody's eyes face-to-face. You just don't have to smell them.
I won't go there and pursue that one, but I will ask you one last kind of macro question. You are with Endeavor today. And Endeavor is you guys are co-authors of so much that we've been talking about in this book. If you meet with Endeavor 3 years from now, and remember, you have not just entrepreneurs here, but you have these community builders. What would you cheer these folks on? What should they be doing perhaps differently? Or what would you look for 3 years from now out of Endeavor to help kind of break through the noise and to have this thing even more successful than it's already been?
So a fundamental principle of mine, it's the first in the Boulder Thesis, is that the leaders have to be entrepreneurs in a startup community. I see many of the leaders I'll just use Endeavor Colorado as an example. The board of Endeavor Colorado is really consisted mostly of entrepreneurs who are leaders in the Boulder startup community, or in the Colorado startup community, Boulder, Denver, primarily. So the board has that characteristic, but many of the Endeavor entrepreneurs don't necessarily view themselves yet as the leaders. Some of them are and play a role of leadership, but some of them don't. Some of them are too focused on their company in the context of the community, but not as a leader of the community. Now, this doesn't mean that they have to spend enormous amounts of time with it. It's just a mind shift. And what I have encountered when I've talked to other companies that are in Endeavor in other parts of the world is you see that kind of dichotomy. You see a little bit of one up, one down between the Endeavor board and the entrepreneurs on the Endeavor board in a local geography and the entrepreneurs that are the Endeavor entrepreneurs. And one of my encouragements would be to try to, in your community, have that collective group play leadership roles and view themselves as leaders, not just within the network of Scale Up and Endeavor, but across the whole startup community. And reach back into earlier stage companies and play leadership roles with those earlier stage companies. And that's powerful because, of course, the companies that become Endeavor companies were once earlier stage companies. And those entrepreneurs play powerful roles for the earlier stage. It's one of the things we're trying to do in Colorado, and I think we're doing reasonably well because there's a lot of crossover between Endeavor, Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network, which is another scale-up organization, Techstars, which has a number of programs. I think we have 3 programs going on 4 in Colorado. David Cohen, who's one of the co-founders of Techstars, is on the Endeavor Colorado board with me. So there's a lot of interconnect between those things. And I just encourage more of that, more of being inclusive of other entrepreneurs and other networks who are scaling up in informal ways is great. It doesn't have to be programmatic. It doesn't have to be time consuming, but just continue to have that kind of a frame of reference. By the way, again, I think Endeavor does a good job of mapping that. And I'm not being critical of Endeavor at all. I'm answering the question of what more, right? Like, I think that what more is powerful. And the other is extend beyond your geography. Very aggressively use the nature of our virtual network now, and extend it beyond the geography with Endeavor, but also in other those communities that are interesting to you, other geographies that are interesting to you, sort of broaden that network too outside.
We got some amazing questions from the folks from Endeavor, both now and before. So I'm going to lightning round you a little bit, but you can take a minute or so to a question if you'd like. And the first, as you can imagine, I'm going to name names because I think it's important you get a sense of where people have come from around the world to be with you. COVID was on everybody's mind at some point. We had entrepreneurs like Indri Toka from Miami, Christian Bulke from Colombia, Peter Stanbury from Argentina, Carlos Garcia from Puerto Rico, Alfie from Indonesia, Seed Comes Wong from Vietnam, Catalyst had Alan Morgan. We have Aaron Hurst from Atlanta. We have got Mina Julia Lopez from Endeavor Colombia. We have George Mazzelli and Ethan Mayers from the world, Claudia Mushalo from Brazil, Cesar Parisima from the Philippines, and literally all thinking about how COVID is changing the game. And so in a kind of a lightning round, first question was, what's your advice on fundraising?
What's my advice on fundraising? If you are a rapidly growing company and you're scaling, which many of you are, there is an enormous amount of capital available to you. That capital is flowing well, and it's flowing well at, in some cases, kind of strangely high prices. And so my suggestion for scale-up entrepreneurs is, if you need to raise money, recognize that it can be done in a virtual context and it can be done quickly, and investors have rapidly adjusted their behavior to it. If your company is not a fast-growing company, but is a stable company, make sure you have capital that gives you runway for a long time, and recognize that the companies being rewarded right now are still the fast growers from a financing perspective. It doesn't mean that if you're a slower grower, you can't raise money, but it's harder. And so then being thoughtful about capital is important. In our portfolio, we've encouraged companies who are medium growers not to inappropriately spend money right now to try to generate fast growth. That seems to not work. And it seems to not work because what you do is you consume your capital quicker, and you may or may not generate faster growth. So like getting the right balance between those in the context of thinking about fundraising is important.
What is the broader advice you're giving operationally? I mean, in the last crisis, Sequoia created this famous deck which told entrepreneurs to shepherd cash and sort of hunker down. What are you telling the entrepreneurs yourself in your portfolio in COVID?
Well, it's very, very good specific advice to shepherd cash and don't hunker down, right? I say that with a twist of sarcasm because I believe that, one of the jobs of the CEO is not to run out of money. So rule number one of a company is don't run out of money. Figure out where your money's going to come from. If you're generating positive cash flow, keep generating it. If you need to raise more capital, make sure you know where your line of supply is, what your investors are willing to give you, even if you can't find new investors. And if you have plenty of capital in moments of stress, get rid of a bunch of experiments and variable spending to make your capital last longer, especially if those things haven't been working and you haven't dealt with them yet. The other advice is that there's so many counterintuitive things going on that it's very, very hard to apply a broad brush to everything. I'll give one example quickly. We have a company in our portfolio that is an interior design marketplace. So they can connect interior designers to people that are in their homes that want to do redesign things in their house. When COVID hit, for the first couple of weeks, their business dropped off dramatically, maybe 50%, 75% for 2 or 3 weeks. And that wasn't that unusual. Everybody kind of freaked out in that moment in terms of what to do. And then after that, suddenly their business came back, and they've had now 2 months in a row, and I think July will be a third of record growth. And it's kind of obvious in hindsight, but it was counterintuitive in the moment, and certainly wasn't the conversation we were having at the beginning of May. about, oh my God, we're going to be on a rocket ship. And the reason we're on a rocket ship is because people sitting around their house for 2 or 3 weeks and they say, I need to redesign my bedroom so it's an office. And this carpet looks terrible. Let's redesign this room. And they can't go to a store to buy furniture, and they can't go to meet with an interior designer. So all of a sudden, the web is that. Pick your place. Video conferencing is an easy one. Telemedicine made 10 years of progress in 4 weeks. And all of a sudden, telemedicine became an area that's incredibly compelling. It's not because technology wasn't there. It was because the incumbent dynamics prevented it. Many of you probably will never go into a grocery store again in your life because you've learned another way to do it that has been around for a while, but it just wasn't dominant. Yeah. So as entrepreneurs, look for the things that are the behavior changes stimulated by this that you play into, versus just try to protect yourself from whatever change just happened.
You've been, I don't say this cavalierly, you've been a hero talking about depression and your own battles with it, and about mental health. And I think it's had huge impact, because I think so many of us and so many people we love in our field are navigating and don't want to talk about it. But a few people asked about, particularly in COVID, how we should be thinking about improving mental health, our own and our team around us. Any advice on that?
Yes, I'll start with the high level, and the most important thing is we have to, as a society, eliminate, not lower, but eliminate the stigma associated with mental health. And I use the word stigma importantly, because the stigma is the inhibitor of people doing things, people communicating, people being vulnerable and exposing themselves, and people being accessible and willing to do things around it. It's one of the reasons I'm so open about my own journey and my own experience, is an effort to eliminate the stigma. Second, one of the very simple things to know, if you're struggling with anything as a leader, depression, anxiety, if you have bipolar disorder, if you're borderline personality disorder, if your behavior is unpredictable, if you're feeling incredible stress, like whatever, which by the way, at various points in time, almost every leader I've ever met experiences multiple
Absolutely.
different layers of that, including just a huge amount of anxiety. And oh, by the way, we've got a disease that's killing people. So the whole notion of existential dread is not out of the question here. Fear of death is one of our biggest motivators as a species in terms of behavior. Do the work on you. I think that's something that so many people are afraid to do. And Jerry Colonna, who is a very, very close friend, for many years was partners with Fred Wilson at their first venture fund, today runs a firm called Reboot and is, I think, the best CEO coach in the world. Jerry has a phrase, which is, to be a great leader, you have to do two things together. You need practical skills development. You have to get better at being a leader and a manager, but you also need to do radical self-inquiry. Radical self-inquiry by itself could be therapy, and practical skills development by itself is taking online courses about how to be a better manager. It's the combination of those two things as a leader that then allows you to be really helpful with other leaders in your organization around their own issues. And actually not where you figure it out and you solve their problems, but where you as a leader create a context where they too can do radical self-inquiry and practical skills development against the backdrop of whatever the cultural norms of your company are.
Because this is also all-encompassing, as business people, as investors, as human beings, we tend to focus about it, as we just have in these past questions. But what advice do you give to your entrepreneurs or to anyone around you about coming out? What do you think about coming out of this?
Coming out of COVID?
Mm-hmm. What advice do you give?
I don't know. I say I don't know because it changes continuously. And it is also very situation specific. And you have to be aware of what the other person's anxiety and dynamics are. So for example, I personally am very afraid of the disease state. My clinically diagnosed anxiety disorder is obsessive compulsive disorder. And so when I am around other people physically right now, I am incredibly anxious irrationally. And so a solution for me to not have irrational anxiety is to not be around other people in a physical sense. And from a business perspective, everybody wants to know, okay, when is this going to end? A phrase that I don't think has any merit or any value is the phrase new normal. Like, we're not going to go back to some version of February 2020. This is a transformative event for the human species. And there will be a lot of people who try to go back to 2020 because as humans, we like predictability, we like consistency. And there's a lot of people who probably didn't like February of 2020. So they're searching for different paths out. I think it's so much better as an entrepreneur to embrace the uncertainty of what the future state looks like and the uncertainty of the time frame of the transitions and recognize that they're non-deterministic, and instead allow yourself to exist in the present moment, working hard at making, your business better, your life better, your society better, your city better, whatever your values are, and applying them in the context of a huge amount of uncertainty rather than anchoring on a predictive outcome goal. And that's why I say, I don't know. I think it changes continually. An example would be when the US and most of the world went down into lockdown in April. The conversation is we have to go into lockdown so we don't have a second wave in the fall when there's infectious respiratory disease season. We have flu season or whatever you want to call it every fall because of a variety of things. Well, now all of a sudden in the US at least, people are saying, oh, well, we're having our second wave now. It's not second wave. This is a first wave. First wave didn't end. Yeah. Right? We didn't do what we should have done as a country to essentially successfully suppress the disease as a country. There are places in the country where it's suppressed. And the example of that for the US, if somebody in the US tries to argue with you, I like to say there's lots of places in the world, right? Endeavor's globe. There's lots of places in the world that are doing a lot better with the disease state. So our behavior is a complex system. Right? You can't control those pieces from the top down. You can only control them from the bottom up with your own behavior. And that's the essence of what I think in the last 2 minutes I've been trying to say. I'll be a book salesman, right? When I say I'm a book salesman, it's all about complex systems.
In people's attempts to stay into the present overall, you've gotten some quick rapid fire questions, if you could, on just kind of the day-to-day stuff. And so Natalie Kalassi from South Africa asked, what important questions can an entrepreneur ask investors?
Say that again.
What is an important question that an entrepreneur can ask an investor?
Two categories. Your existing investor and an investor that you're talking to that you want to invest. For your existing investor, I think one of the things that's a really good thing to ask your existing investor is, how do you feel? Shift it to a personal. Your existing investors being asked questions all the time, like, do you have money for us? What do we need to do? How is your portfolio? Just be personal with your investor. How do you feel? Not how is it going, right? That's going to elicit an answer of either okay or some bullshit or some whatever. Something that pushes a little deeper. I think that's something powerful with your existing investors, because as an investor, I think, many investors are spending a lot of time trying to help and trying to respond, but in their constrained way. And there's not a lot of people that are doing that investigation of them. And the entrepreneur can change the relationship with their existing investor in this moment with that in a powerful way. With an investor that you don't know yet, or that you're trying to attract to engage in your company, I would do the same kind of dimension with some other companies in their portfolio that have similar characteristics to you, so you can learn from them. Don't try to attract them as an investor through convincing them of all the great things you're doing right now. Try to engage with them as an investor so that you start to develop a relationship. So all of a sudden they say, this is an entrepreneur I want to work with. And the best way to do that is to engage with existing portfolio companies of theirs, especially, by the way, if there's something your company as a scale up can do to help some of their earlier stage companies, because that's a magic trick for later stage companies. If you want to get an investor's attention, do something that is productive and helpful and proactive for one of their earlier stage investors. You will then have them as an advocate for you, and that will then start a conversation at a totally different level.
Paco Villarreal of Mexico asked a question with Jonathan Whittle of the wonderful Kona Capital sort of as an addendum to, which is, how should these entrepreneurs be thinking about the timing of when to raise a Series A? And what advice do you give to someone if that Series A may look like a down round?
Today, don't worry about down rounds. I think one of the challenges historically of venture, especially in the world that we've been in, where we've been in a very sort of up and to the right kind of financing market for a while, is there's a lot of fear of signaling around doing a down round. If your business is not able to raise money at an up round, but is able to raise more money at a down round, just view that as continued capitalization and readjustment of the valuation of your business. You have to sort of emotionally get out of the cycle. Is it fun? Do you want to do a down round? No, but get out of the emotional part of it in terms of your head and be very practical about the need for money. If you need money, again, there's money flowing. And if you're a company that's fast growing, even a Series A type company, there's plenty of financings available at attractive prices. If you're not fast growing, or you haven't hit product market fit yet, or you're earlier on the curve, the primary source of capital is going to come from your existing investors, or people who are connected to your existing investors. So rather than spend a lot of time running a very broad-based drill, if you're in that category, really work through your existing investors to size up how much money you have from them and to get additional money from there. Quick example that I can do in 30 seconds. We have a company in our portfolio that I would say is probably Series A-ish. They're doing an acquisition. They could do an outside financing and get an outside lead and raise money. The acquisition's a very attractive one for the combined company. The founder wants to raise a relatively small amount of equity, and given where they're at, he'd have to raise more equity probably than he wants to if he had a new investor. So he sized what he was doing to roughly raise $3 million of new equity and the rest to do the acquisition in debt. Sort of went around the table. He's already got around the table $6 million of equity.
Wow.
And his question to me is, hey, should I raise more equity? And my answer is, these are your existing investors. Figure out your dilution level. Like, there's a price, figure out where you hit your dilution level, but raise to your dilution level, because better to have more equity in the bank as you're going. But if he had gone out to raise an outside round in this moment, he would have spent the next 30 days talking to lots of people. He probably would have got a financing done. He might have ended up with a price that was lower than he wanted and more money than he wanted, so he would have been outside that dilution range. So don't just run the historical, traditional, default sort of, okay, I need to go find a new investor. Press on your existing investors to really understand what they want to do and what they're willing to do in this moment.
So powerful overall. David Sprang asked, do you have any thoughts or theology on venture debt?
Yeah, I've been a longtime fan of venture debt. In the appropriate amounts. And I'll separate venture debt from mezz debt or structured debt, sort of later stage. I think that the venture debt providers who are high quality, and they include organizations like SVB. There historically was Square One, which was bought by Pacific West Bank. There have been now some spin-outs. And again, these are mostly US, although SVB, of course, is global. Another one that's global is JP Morgan, that's entered into this market aggressively. But you have Signature Bank, very large US bank that has a very large presence, and then other parts of the world. Like, I think that venture debt is good, essentially runway extension when you have support from your existing investors. It's much lower cost of capital than equity. The venture debt providers are generally investing because they believe that the investors are going to put more money in the company, and that they're looking for the long-term relationship, and that's their way to have a long-term relationship. The mistake that companies make with venture debt is either they use it for runway extension without confidence that they're going to get the next round financed. And so you really have to understand with your investors where your investors stand and how they think about venture debt. Most investors, I think, today think about it correctly, but some of them don't. Some of them actually don't view it in the way that I think the venture debt provider cares about, and that's an open conversation. And the other is, if your business is not working well, the venture debt will work against you, because it really is on top of the capital structure. And in any scenario, the venture debt is going to put downward pressure on the capital structure if your business is not working. And that's going to inhibit things. So having too much venture debt also is a problem. Having a small amount doesn't really matter. Last comment I make on this, again, I'll be a good book salesman. My book, Venture Deals, the fourth edition of it, this one. See, a good book salesman keeps his books nearby so he can do this, and has a chapter on venture debt, a new chapter, and it's entirely on venture debt. And the team at SVB helped write the chapter. It's very extensive. I think it's the first time that like all of the different characteristics of how they at SVB think about venture debt applies, and it's very balanced. It's not a sales pitch for SVB or a sales pitch for venture debt. It's very much help understand the entrepreneur understand how to think about it.
I have to tell, I mean, again, I've been doing this for 15 years and I refer to your book and learn from it every time. So it's not just a pitch, it's a tool for you folks out there who don't have it. Entrepreneurs, by the way, you should understand how investors are investing, and the book will really take you through that language. We're going to wrap as we get toward the end of our hour, Brad, a little bit about you. And Samir Sola of the UAE asked, what do you wish you knew earlier in your career that you know now?
So I just did a very long form podcast with Tim Ferriss, if you're fans of Tim Ferriss.
Yeah.
It's number 448. I think it's the one that's the most current. And it's a 150-minute answer to that question in some ways. Because, you know, Tim doesn't focus on the particular thing that you sort of got on the podcast to talk about, which in this case, the thing that prompted us to do the podcast was the Startup Community Way. I don't think we start talking about the Startup Community Way till about an hour 20. So here are 3 quick hits I wish I knew when I was 20. Number 1, I wish I took care of myself. I wish I had created time and space for me. I knew what I liked to do besides work, but I didn't prioritize it. I didn't give myself the time and space to have a sustainable arc. And so I had many boom and bust emotional and physical moments as I was in my 20s and my 30s. And even into my 40s. My last major depression was when I was 47. And it was the same thing, just not taking care of myself. The second, and it comes from my relationship with Amy, who's Amy Batchelor and I have been together for 30 years now. But Amy's my second wife. I married my high school girlfriend. We fortunately didn't have kids, so it was more like a breakup in your young 20s. But 10 years into my relationship with Amy, we almost split up. And I tell that story on Tim's podcast. And I also start the book that Amy and I wrote together called The Startup Life with that story. And the essence of that, which is the second lesson, is my words didn't match my actions. I didn't have an affair. I didn't do things like that. But I would tell Amy that she was the most important person in my life. And then in 2000, before caller ID and before smartphones, when my phone would ring, I would answer it no matter what we were doing. Pick your adult activity. And I would just answer the phone. And so my words and my actions didn't sync up. I told her she was the most important, but my behavior wasn't that. And, you know, we worked through that, and, you know, our relationship is extremely healthy, but that was a moment where our relationship almost ended. That was number 2. And number 3, as you get older, as I've gotten older, I used to think that I was at peace with the idea that life was finite and that one day I died and it was over. And I went through a phase, and I would say that, like I'm at peace with it, like I get it. And I went through a phase in my 40s where I realized I was full of shit, that I had not actually come to terms with that I was like behaving in a certain way as a defense against this fear of death that I actually was carrying around. And that was part of my own continual exploration and journey. And I think that's a thing that is a positive that I've been doing since I was in my 20s, but I would just reinforce to everybody, is the continual, we used radical self-inquiry earlier as the phrase from Jerry Colonna, the continual exploration of what matters to you in your finite time on this planet. The discovery of what you care about, knowing that's going to change over time. And then, you know, the endless series of small experiments to try things to see if they're interesting to do more of. And when the experiments fail, you learn from them. And when the experiments succeed, you do more of it. And again, instinctively, I think I was doing this in my 20s because I've been an entrepreneur from the beginning. I started my first company when I was 19, but I didn't encapsulate that into my life philosophy. And I think as you get older, it becomes more and more richer to behave that way on a continual basis.
We're going to wrap. We had so many more questions, and you've been so generous with your time. But I do want to wrap with Claudia Durant's of Endeavor Miami, who asked, what is the best advice you have ever received?
My favorite one-liner is from Len Fassler. Len bought my first company with a guy named Jerry Pock. They were co-chairman of the public company about my first company. Len is in his late 80s. He's one of my closest friends. I'm about to put up a podcast with him that I did for the Techstars Give First podcast, which was an emotionally wonderful thing to be able to sit and interview him for 45 minutes at this stage in his life. At the very depth of the internet bubble, as a company we were co-chairman of that was public, that at its peak had been worth $3 billion, was collapsing. I was sitting at his breakfast table in his house in Harrison, New York, exhausted, dejected, miserable, fearful of the day in front of me, and another day of grinding misery as this company and all the other companies in my world were falling apart in 2000, 2001, as the internet bubble was collapsing. I was chewing on a stale bagel. I didn't even have the energy to toast a fucking bagel. And Len comes up behind me. And I like to think of Len as a Jewish Yoda, you know, like a little Yoda-like character comes up behind me and he puts his arms around me and gives me a big hug from behind as I'm sitting there dejected. And then he puts his arms on my shoulders like this, you know, like gives me a pat from behind. And he says, all right, come on, Brad, let's go. They can't kill you and they can't eat you. Suit up. And in that moment, like, he was done. He didn't have to work. He was fully retired. He was doing this because of me. We were co-chairman of this company. He was doing it because I asked him to. And he was just in it. And they can't kill you and they can't eat you. Let's go do the work. And yeah, we know it's going to suck. We know it's going to be no fun. We know it's going to be hard. We know it's going to be challenging. But it's our responsibility in this moment. So we decide, if you don't want to do the work, just say you don't want to do the work and quit. But right, they can't kill you and they can't eat you. I carry that around with me every day.
Well, I think every one of us are going to carry it around with us as well. I might even get a tattoo of it. It's just so brilliant. But look, on behalf of Linda and the Endeavor team, and I know everyone on this call right now, I just can't thank you enough. It's been such a treat to hear this. And everyone, you know the link. You have the link to the book, and you'll get a special deal even if you get it. And thanks so much, Brad. We're looking forward to having more engagement with you and the Endeavor family, you know, for the rest of our days. Thank you.
Chris, thank you. And Endeavor, thank you for hosting me. And everybody out there, I'm thrilled and delighted to be part of the Endeavor family. So awesome stuff.
Awesome. You